My name is Claire Holden. I still remember the afternoon sunlight filtering through the kitchen blinds when I found the letter. It lay on the wooden countertop like an unwelcome guest, its edges crisp and unbent, as if my mother had labored over every word before sealing it. I picked it up with trembling fingers, not out of hope but curiosity for the depth of rejection she could muster against her own daughter. The envelope was heavy in my hand, and I sensed that whatever lay inside would shift something fundamental in me. As I slit the seal, my stomach clenched. The neat, looping handwriting was unmistakably hers. In a single breathless sentence, she closed the door on years of strained affection. Don't try coming to the family reunion. You're not welcome here anymore. There was no apology, no explanation, just a verdict passed down with finality. In that moment, I didn't collapse in tears as I might have expected. There was only a quiet ache growing in my chest. I leaned against the counter, the letter crumpling slightly in my grasp, and I thought of all the times I'd tried to earn her approval, straightening my grades, volunteering at the community center, hesitating before I spoke so she wouldn't scold me. None of it mattered. To her, I was an inconvenient reminder of the man she'd chosen to forget. I pictured my brother Jake at her side, basking in her pride as I stood on the sidelines. Fading into the woodwork, there was a solitary clarity in that moment of rejection. The sunlight on my face felt cold, and I realized that the reunion she planned without me would be a celebration of my erasure. But beneath the sting of her words, something else flickered, a calm determination. As I folded the letter and slid it into my pocket, I whispered to myself that this would not be the end of my story. If she thought she could silence me with a single line, she had underestimated the quiet strength I'd been nurturing all my life. When I texted her back, I typed only one word, understood. It felt stark on the screen, a line drawn in the sand. I didn't want to dignify her accusations with a long, pleading response or frantic questions. I didn't need to explain my pain or beg for a place at their table. In that small reply, I acknowledged her decree and closed that chapter in a single breath. I turned off my phone and sat on the edge of my bed, letting the silence settle around me. It was in that hush that I heard my own heartbeat, steady and resolute. I thought of the promises I made to myself as a child, that I would never allow anyone's rejection to define my worth. My mother's message was harsh, but it was not the final word on who I was or what I deserved. Images from my childhood drifted through my mind. Me clutching my father's hand as we walked along lake shores, his warm laughter rising above the whisper of reeds. Those moments were rare and hidden, but they were real. They reminded me that beyond my mother's gaze and her resentment there was someone who saw me clearly, who valued my presence. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering my thoughts, refusing to wallow in self-pity. I called my oldest friend, Mara, and asked if she'd come over with coffee. I needed a witness to my decision to rise above anger, a confidant who would help me channel my hurt into something constructive. As I watched her headlights appear in the driveway, I felt a flicker of hope. I was not a lone dot in the soft light of friendship. I made another silent vow. I would unearth my mother's secrets, piece by piece, until the truth shone brighter than her words. And when the time came, I would stand before her unbowed. My childhood in our sprawling farmhouse was defined by division. My mother's second marriage brought Jake into the world, and with him came a new focus of her affection. While I learned early to tread lightly, to keep my voice low when she spoke, I watched her lean into Jake's every smile, celebrate his smallest triumphs, and shield him from criticism. In contrast, I became the silent canvas on which she painted her disappointments, a reminder of the man she'd left behind. I remember afternoons spent alone in the attic, tracing patterns in the dust motes swirling in the sunlight, wondering where I fit. The house echoed with laughter and music when Jake bolted home from school, and I would slip into the background, pretending to read while my heart pinched with longing. I never blamed him. He was simply the preferred child. It was my mother's resentment of my father's memory that left me orphaned in my own home. At night, I would lie awake listening to distant echoes of her whispered prayers for Jake's future safe, steady, predictable, and I envied him fiercely. In my dreams, I would call out to a father I barely knew, aching for the embrace of someone who wished I could stay. The absence of that love carved a hollow inside me that I filled with books and daydreams of escape. As I grew older, I learned to cloak my hurt in self-sufficiency. I excelled in school, poured my heart into art, and convinced myself that independence was its own reward. Still, the ache remained a quiet ghost at the edge of every celebration. It taught me that belonging could be conditional, that love might be withheld, and that sometimes the only refuge from rejection was within my own heart. Yet even as I thrived in worlds of my own making, I could not entirely shut out the longing for reconnection. The memory of my father's gentle smile was a beacon in the darkness, promising that somewhere, someone believed in me. It was a promise I would one day reclaim. When my father first reached out, I was surprised by the trembling in his voice. It came one evening, just as the sky was fading into dusk. His number flashed on my phone, an old landline I hadn't heard from in years, and something in me softened instead of recoiling. I answered, and he spoke my name as though it were a benediction. That single utterance carried decades of remorse and longing. We met the next morning at a small cafe on the edge of town, far from prying ears and judgmental glances. He arrived in a faded blue truck that looked as worn as his hands. I sat across from him, watching his eyes search mine, and I felt the rush of everything I had missed. There was an awkward pause before we spoke, but neither of us needed to fill it. In that silence, we rebuilt fragments of trust. He told me about the years he'd spent regretting the divorce, how he'd stayed away because he didn't want to make things worse. He admitted he'd been too proud, too scared to fight for me against someone so determined to erase his memory. I listened, my heart twisting with both anger and compassion. I realized then how much our unspoken guilt had shaped both our lives. Week after week, we returned to that cafe. We shared breakfasts and held long conversations about art, about the small town we grew up in, about the stories I'd never told my mother. He showed me photographs of his travels after the divorce, of Sorrento sunsets and Parisian rooftops, and I saw in them a man who had tried to fill his loneliness with distance. In turn, I poured out my own years of silence, the ache of always feeling like an outsider in my childhood home. Our bond deepened under the hum of old jazz records and the clink of coffee cups. I began to understand that his love for me had never truly vanished. It had been buried beneath the rubble of failed promises, and he asked for nothing more than the chance to be part of my life again. As summer ripened, he handed me a worn envelope, saying only that it contained something important. When I peeked inside, I found the final amendment to his will signed, notarized, and bearing my name alone. I gripped it with reverent disbelief, understanding at last that he had chosen to trust me with everything he had left. In that moment, I carried both the weight of his love and the promise of what was to come. The weekend of the family reunion arrived with a warm breeze that carried the scent of grilled burgers and honeysuckle. I watched from the edge of the property, concealed behind the hedgerows, as my mother guided guests toward the white folding chairs arranged in neat rows. She wore her proudest smile, eyes bright, lips curved, unaware of the secret that lay buried beneath every footstep on this land. Jake, dressed in a sharply pressed polo, moved among the neighbors and cousins, regaling them with his latest sales achievement and the grand plans he had for our acreage. He punctuated each boast with my mother's approving nod, and I felt a hollow ache watching them celebrate a legacy that no longer belonged to them. I slipped away for a moment and sat under the old oak where, as a child, I used to scratch my name into the bark. I fingered the creases of the amended will tucked safely in my bag, marveling at the simple power of a signature. That legal parchment signed with my father's hand was my shield and my sword. It was the proof that the land he loved and the memories embedded in its soil were mine to protect. I closed my eyes and let the afternoon sounds wash over me. Laughter, clinking glasses, the distant strum of a guitar. They were the soundtrack of a celebration that had excluded me. When I returned to the gathering, the toasts had begun. My mother raised her glass and spoke of family unity, of traditions passed down through generations. Jake lifted his in agreement, eyes alight with triumph. I stood a few yards away in the shade, glass of water in hand, feeling the weight of their words like splinters against my skin. In that moment, they thought they were celebrating me to my achievements, my place in the lineage. But they had no idea how profoundly they were wrong. I turned and walked quietly toward my car. Each step felt deliberate, measured. I did not hurry. I did not hesitate. By the time the sun dipped low, painting the sky in bruised purples, I had already driven to the county recorder's office. In the hush of late afternoon, I filed the deed transfer. As the clerk stamped the new title in my name, a calm resolve settled in my bones. I was no longer the shadowed daughter, silenced by resentment. I was the heiress of our past and the architect of my own future. The next morning, I awoke to an email notification from my attorney. My heart thumped as I read the subject line: Notice of Title Transfer and Occupancy. I clicked it open and felt a surge of power mixed with an ache I couldn't quite name. Attached was the formal notice. My mother and Jake had 30 days to vacate the property or negotiate a lease agreement. The words on the screen were clinical and precise, yet they carried the weight of every unspoken hurt and every secret meeting with my father. I sat at my kitchen table, sunlight slanting through the blinds, and remembered how this land had been woven into my childhood dreams. The rolling fields where I'd chased fireflies, the creek banks where I'd shared secrets with my dad, every memory was now mine to protect. I thought of my mother's laughter as she distributed lemonade to family friends, unaware that the ground beneath her feet had changed hands. I felt sorry for her, not enough to soften my resolve, but enough to acknowledge the tragedy of her own making. I drafted a brief text to my brother, careful to keep my tone measured. Check your email. We'll talk when you're ready. I didn't need to gloat. The law was on my side, and I'd let its clarity speak for me. After I sent it, I closed my laptop and paced the room, each step a reminder of the journey I'd taken from the corner of my mother's favor to the center of my own destiny. As the deadline loomed, neighbors began to murmur. Rumors leaked out. Claire Holden, the daughter who never came home, the unexpected landowner. I let the whispers circulate. It felt good to be spoken of, even if in astonished tones. I wasn't seeking revenge, but I would never apologize for claiming what was rightly mine. That evening, I walked the boundary line, barefoot in the grass, and let the warm breeze carry away my doubts. The sunset painted the sky in molten gold, and I imagined the life I would build here, a sanctuary of honesty and belonging, free from the shadows of hidden resentments. In the soft twilight, I whispered a promise to myself and to my father's memory. This land would become the legacy he never had a chance to see. The first knock on my door came mid-morning, firm and insistent. I opened it to find Jake standing there, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. He held a sheaf of papers, printed copies of the deed, the attorney's notice, the email I'd sent him. His voice shook as he accused me of betrayal, of tearing our family apart with a single signature. I listened quietly, arms folded, feeling the old ache of his childhood triumphs turned cold. He stormed past me into the living room, spreading the documents across the coffee table. How could you? He demanded. This land was supposed to be mine. You know how much Mom sacrificed to keep it in the family. I watched the tight set of his jaw and the quick dart of his eyes as he searched mine for some sign of regret. There was none. I told him softly that the land had always belonged to my father, that he chose me because I was the one who never stopped believing in him. I reminded Jake of the times he'd laughed at my dreams, the way he'd echoed Mom's coldness when I sought her approval. I didn't raise my voice. The calm in my tone seemed to catch him off guard more than any shout. He scoffed, colliding with my calm. "So this is about Dad?" he spat. "You think you're the only one who loved him?" My chest tightened. There was truth in his pain, too, but I held my ground. I spoke of late-night talks with Dad in that same living room, of the trust he placed in me when he knew his time was nearly up. I told Jake that my claim was not an act of vengeance, but a fulfillment of my father's final wish. When Mom arrived an hour later, the tension crackled between us like a gathering storm. She stood in the doorway, hands clasped, eyes rimmed with unexpected tears. I saw for the first time the weight of her own regrets mirrored in her gaze. She whispered that she never meant to hurt me, that her life had been defined by a fear of forgetting the past. I stepped forward and reached out, touching her arm gently. "I forgive you," I said, voice soft but unwavering. "But I won't give up what he entrusted to me." In that moment, amidst the silent witnesses of oak and iris that lined the edge of our land, something shifted. Pain was still there, a raw thread between us, but so was the fragile beginning of understanding. A week later, my attorney's phone rang with my mother's number, and I watched her pace the living room as she tried to negotiate. She offered a lease, a yearly payment that barely scratched the surface of the land's true worth, as if money could mend years of neglect. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, the late afternoon light painting long shadows on the wooden surface. Jake hovered behind her chair, arms crossed and jaw clenched, his eyes flicking between us with a mixture of guilt and defiance. I listened as Mom's voice wavered through the phone speaker, carefully measuring each word. She spoke of family legacy and honor, but I heard the desperation beneath every syllable. When she finally hung up, her hands shook as she placed the receiver down. "They won't let us stay," she said softly, as if confessing a secret. I could see the lines of worry around her eyes, the weight of admitting that perhaps she'd been wrong. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "This isn't about money," I said, keeping my voice calm. "It's about respect for my father's last wish and respect for me." I told her that leasing would only delay the inevitable, that I needed to know if they intended to honor the legacy he left behind or if they planned to continue erasing it. Jake shifted uneasily, breaking his silence for the first time. "We just don't want to lose our home," he said, voice small dot in that moment. The raw ache of family tension pulsed between us. I thought of the fireflies I'd chased here as a child, of the creek's gentle lilt reminding me of my father's laughter. I realized that what I truly wanted was not to punish them, but to reclaim a place where love wasn't conditional. I offered them a choice. They could stay on these fields as tenants, yes, but under terms of fairness and acknowledgement of my ownership, terms that included open dialogue and genuine reconciliation. Mom's shoulders slumped, and for the first time I saw her truly seeing me, not as the inconvenient reminder of a past she'd buried, but as the daughter who refused to be erased. She swallowed hard and nodded. The silence that followed was heavy with all we hadn't said over the years, yet it also held the fragile promise of a new beginning, one where our shared history could finally be honored rather than hidden in shadow. In the days that followed our tense kitchen conversation, the air between us felt both fragile and charged. My mother and Jake moved back onto the property under the terms we'd agreed, a fair lease, respectful of my ownership, and a promise of honest communication. Each morning, I watched them unload boxes from the truck, their movements stiff at first, as if they weren't sure they still belonged here. I carried coffee out to the porch, setting mugs on the railing, and we exchanged quiet, not small, gestures of acknowledgement that spoke louder than any apology. One afternoon, Jake asked if I would help him repair the old fence along the western border. We grabbed hammers and nails and worked side by side, our shoulders brushing occasionally as we lifted weathered boards back into place. He hesitated before speaking, voice low and uncertain. "I'm sorry, Claire. I didn't realize how much this meant to you, how much it always meant to both of us." I paused, my hammer in midair, and saw in his eyes the same longing I had felt as a child. In that moment, the rigid distance between us cracked, and we found ourselves sharing stories of our dad, of the fishing trip where he taught us to tie knots, of his goofy dance in the living room when he thought no one was watching. My mother came down the path then, holding a tray of lemonade. She stood beside us, her eyes glossy with unshed tears, and asked if she could join in. She picked up a board and handed me a nail, her touch tentative but sincere. As we worked together, the tension loosened, and I felt the old ache soften into something warmer. We laughed when a board slipped and splintered, and for the first time in years, the three of us felt like a family again, imperfect, bruised, but still bound by the roots we shared. That evening, we sat on the porch steps, watching fireflies drift through the twilight. My mother reached out to take my hand and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on us." I squeezed her fingers gently, my heart full of cautious hope. The land beneath our feet was still mine by law, but in that golden hour it felt like a home we were all building together. And for the first time, I believed that the scars we carried could heal, one careful nail and one shared memory at a time. Spring arrived on the property with a gentle insistence, coaxing emerald shoots from the dark earth and whispering promises of new beginnings. I woke early one morning to the sound of robins singing beneath my window and slipped on boots to wander the fields. The air was cool, tinged with dew, and every blade of grass seemed to shiver with life. As I walked the winding path past the creek's edge, I thought of all the ways my father had cherished this land, how he spoke of it as a living thing, deserving of care and respect. Now, it was mine to guard and to nurture. Behind me, I heard the soft creak of the porch swing and turned to see my mother there, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill. She offered me a steaming mug of coffee without a word, and I accepted it with a nod. We sat side by side, our shoulders almost touching, and watched the sun rise over the distant hills. The silence between us was comfortable now, seasoned by months of shared labor and honest conversation. I realized then that forgiveness wasn't a single act, but a series of small, deliberate choices, like planting seeds and tending them through wind and rain. Later that day, Jake joined me by the old oak tree where I'd once carved my name as a child. He handed me a sapling, slender and bright, and said, "Dad would have liked this spot." Together, we knelt in the soft soil and dug a hole deep enough for the roots to settle. As we lifted the young tree and settled its base, our hands brushed, and I felt the old ache give way to something warmer, pride, perhaps, or the fragile bloom of trust. We packed the earth around the sapling, patting it down gently, and I whispered, "Welcome home." By evening, the two of them returned to the farmhouse with plans to restore the barn and plant a vegetable garden along the fence line. I walked past, my heart full, and marveled at how the land had become a living bridge between past hurts and future hope. In choosing to honor my father's final wish and to share that inheritance with my family, I had reclaimed my own story. As dusk settled, I stood at the crest of the hill, arms open to the violet sky, and felt the quiet resilience inside me rise up. This place, once a battleground of secrets and resentment, was now a testament to our love, our loss, and our capacity to grow. And I knew, with a certainty I'd never felt before, that we would thrive here together at last.